afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this Central Asia Program event organized in cooperation with Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, who is really becoming one of our key partners now in organizing events in DC, and that's really great to see this cooperation developing, so thank you, Muhammad. Today we'll be discussing Russia's approaches to Afghanistan and its implication for both Afghanistan and the Central Asian region, so it's a very key, central, critical topics, very timely one, knowing what is going on in the region now. And for that, we have two great speakers who will be, each of them presenting different aspects of that question. The first one is Steve Blanc, who is a very well-known specialist, and I don't know if I really need to introduce you, Steve, here for the DC community. Steve worked for more than 20 years at the U.S. Army War College, and is now at the American Foreign Policy Council, a famous specialist on Russia's geopolitical and military development, and working on both Russia's relationship to the Arctic, to the Far East, and to Central Asia and Afghanistan. And our second speaker is Amin Mudadiq, the head of the Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty Pakistan service, especially looking at what is happening in the tribal region. And Amin is himself originally from northern Afghanistan, so it's really a unique perspective on the ground of what is going on the ground. So we will try to make the connection between the big pictures of Russia reorganizing its relationship to Afghanistan and what it means really locally on the ground for the people and the local realities. So thank you again for coming. Thank you for our two speakers to be here today, and let me begin by giving the floor to Steve.
Thank you, Marlene. It's a pleasure to be here and talk about Russia and Afghanistan. As I was just telling David Isby, I've been doing that for 40 years now, and it probably is not going to stop. So I want to say, first, what is Russia doing in Afghanistan, and then come to the why, and hopefully we'll have time to discuss what it means. First of all, since 2013, Moscow has been sharing intelligence with the Taliban. This is not something new. It starts at least 4 years ago, if not earlier. Second, as U.S. commanders have now said, Moscow is transferring weapons to the Taliban. It's also cooperating with Iran to promote the Taliban as a political movement in Afghanistan. It is third, strengthening its own military presence in Central Asia. What that means is, first of all, selling more subsidized weapons to Central Asia. They just recently announced a major deal with Uzbekistan, which is important because under Karimov, there were very few such deals. Under the new government, under Mirziyoyev, there is obviously a better relationship, and Russia is now selling weapons, presumably at subsidized prices, to Tashkent, as well as to other governments in Central Asia, and engaging in military training exercises and educating officers in Moscow and things like that. Beyond that, if you follow the Russian press, Moscow regularly exercises its forces in Central Asia and with regard to potential scenarios that it thinks might develop in Central Asia in other parts of Russia. And when it does this, and this is quite recent, we have now seen the transfer of new weapons or the use of new weapons in these exercises. When I say new weapons, I mean weapons that have not been seen ever before in Central Asia. UAVs, that is Russian UAVs, because the Americans have been doing this for some time, and the Iskander missile in its conventional format, which is a very interesting development because, as many of you know, the Europeans are and the United States military is very worried about the Iskander. It's a dual-use missile that comes in conventional and nuclear formats, and it can be used either as a ballistic missile or as a cruise missile. So they have learned from our use of missiles in Afghanistan and are experimenting with the idea of using Iskander, if they have to, in Central Asia and in Afghanistan. And they are also thereby improving the quality, if not the quantity, of Russian forces in Central Asia. Fourth, politically, they have already begun to organize a, quote, peace process. I use the word quotes because I'm skeptical that it's really going to bring about peace, or that it's a real peace process in any sense of the word. among Russia, China, Pakistan, and Taliban. Notably, the Afghan government was not invited to the first meeting. When Kabul protested, they said, well, you can come to the second meeting. But nothing has come about since that meeting, and it remains to be seen where this process is actually going. But the point is, as I said earlier, that Iran and Russia together are promoting the Taliban, and the idea of this, quote, peace process is that the solution to Afghanistan lies not in the current government, but in a reconstituted government that is a government of national reconciliation, that's the Russian term, which the Taliban would take part. This sounds to a historian all too reminiscent of the 1940s and other Soviet examples, because it's not clear to me, and nor is it clear to US commanders, that the Taliban have ceased to become terrorists and would play a responsible role as part of a future government in Afghanistan. Furthermore, with regard to Central Asia as a whole, the Russian alliance, and I believe there is one, with China. As a matter of fact, the Russians asked for an alliance in 2014 with China against terrorism and color revolution. They have tightened that alliance in Central Asia, despite the enormous literature that says that Russo-Chinese relations are bad, or fractured, or fissures, and there are all kinds of problems. The opposite is actually happening. There are problems, many of them in Central Asia, but as Putin just said the other day, they always work to find common solutions, and this is very true in Central Asia as well. Sixth, since 2012, Moscow has greatly improved its relationship with Pakistan. This is something important because Russian analysts used to say Pakistan was the most dangerous country in the world, the most dangerous proliferator, and they had a pretty good argument, given what we know about Pakistani policy and the nuclear dilemmas that come out of that policy. But since 2012, Russia has opened up major dialogue with Pakistan. They have sold it weapons. There are discussions about a second weapon sale, although nothing conclusive as of yet. There have been joint exercises. There is talk of energy sales from Russia to Pakistan, if they can figure out how to build a pipeline that will get Russian oil or gas to Pakistan. And Pakistan the other day announced that it is soliciting more Russian investment, particularly in energy, which they have a desperate need for. But again, there are many problems before this happens. But the statement itself is worthy of notice, because it points to the larger question. And furthermore, systematically in the last 4 years, Moscow, and this is clearly related to the broader degeneration or disintegration of Russo-American relations, has systematically cast doubt on the US policy in Afghanistan, basically saying that we don't believe you can win. And this was particularly true under Obama, but it's still going on. Every time the United States either says it's going to leave or that more troops are going to be added, the Russians say, you guys don't know what you're doing, troops aren't going to be the answer, and you don't have a coherent policy. Whether or not they're right is an interesting question, but this is certainly the line that the Russian government is taking. So bearing all these developments in mind, you have to ask yourself, why? Because up till 2013, they supported the NATO operation in Afghanistan, and we even had a supply route to northern
distribution network.
Northern Distribution Network, NDN, going through Russia to supply Afghanistan, because there were a lot of concerns about relying exclusively on Pakistan, who's had a very, very rocky relationship with the United States under Obama and apparently still does. So I would argue that the following considerations are what's driving Russia. 2013 is the year in which ISIS makes its appearance on the world stage, and the Russians profess to be spooked by ISIS. They are clearly worried about the potential for ISIS to operate in Central Asia if Afghanistan falls to ISIS, which is rivaling to Taliban in Central Asia, and even more should ISIS go to North Caucasus. They were so worried about it, they actually opened the borders and let North Caucasus and Central Asian terrorists go through Russia to Syria to export the problem in 2013 and 14. So this is a novel way to get rid of terrorists. You send them to another terrorist. You let them go to another terrorist theater and then claim you're fighting terrorism. They publicly have stated that they did not expect the Afghan government to survive, and that was 3 or 4 years ago. It's still the case. It is very clear that they blame the US, expected to lose, and have stated that basically they have no confidence in American strategy, and since the American strategy is really what NATO is carrying out, that's a vote of no confidence in the larger NATO operation as a whole as well. So if you expect Afghanistan to fall, given the fact that they do have something of a domino theory in terms of threat assessment, that if Central Asia falls, that if Afghanistan falls, Central Asia's next, you want to strengthen your position in Central Asia and in Afghanistan. And third, they believe that the Taliban are more responsible, that they are not interested in the areas outside of Afghanistan, and that if they have a share in the government, they will behave. Now, this contradicts everything the Russians have been saying for over a decade about the fact that there's no such thing as a good terrorist. Going back to the 90s when the Chechens started, they were fulminating against everybody who said, well, there are good terrorists and bad terrorists, or so they argued. But for them, clearly the Taliban are good terrorists, and if you look at Russian policy towards terrorism in the Middle East and elsewhere, they decide who the terrorist is. Just because we call somebody a terrorist doesn't mean he is. Hamas, for example, are not terrorists, which will strike most Western and Israeli observers as a rather bizarre approach. The same is true, obviously, now with regard to the Taliban. They are quasi-responsible if they are given a share. How this discovery came about, I'm at a loss to understand, but that's the line. They obviously are very worried about ISIS terrorism spreading, therefore, from Central Asia to the North Caucasus. And they're scared because, one, because it could destabilize these areas, and even more, I would argue, because they don't want to have to fight in Central Asia. Russia makes a great deal out of the fact that it is the Ordnungsmacht, if you like, the security provider or power that creates order in Central Asia, but they don't want to have to cash that check if it's presented at the bank. Because, as those of us who've been doing this for a long time remember, they didn't do so well the last time. And they know full well what the risks are in fighting in Central Asia and Afghanistan. And they would prefer not to have to do it under any circumstances, and particularly now because they have reached the limit of their military resources. They actually had to cut military spending by a certain amount this year, or at least reduce the rate of its growth. So a fourth war, in addition to North Caucasus, Syria, and Ukraine, would be a very serious political, economic, and military affair, and one they don't want. So typically Russians start by making a major show of force, while at the same time dealing with the Taliban under the table, is their way of saying, we are going to defend Central Asia, but also we're going to find a political solution that keeps the problem out of Central Asia. They therefore are showing, and this is a major point in overall Russian military policy, that they cannot afford a protracted war, or don't want to fight protracted wars anywhere. If Russia does get involved in a war, it wants to be able to move in and win quickly and bring about a fait accompli and a reasonably fast political solution at a low cost. And therefore, it is unwilling to have its bluff called as the protector of Central Asia, because it might turn out that they cannot succeed in that role, and I don't think they are fully confident of the results if they get involved in a land war in Central Asia against terrorists or in Afghanistan because of what happened 30, 40 years ago. They see the US as failing, and they don't want to be left with the responsibility, therefore, if we fail in Afghanistan, of having to pay that bill, as I suggested. And at the same time, they see their new policy of dealing with the Taliban and stigmatizing US policy as a way of embarrassing Washington, and then therefore it connects with the larger deterioration of Russo-American relations and their general attacks on America as having a failed strategy and of intervening abroad and not knowing what it's going to achieve, and failing, therefore, to achieve anything positive, and thus making things worse. This strategy, therefore, also preserves, at a reasonable cost, Moscow's military leadership in Central Asia, precisely because its bluff doesn't have to be called. So he can posture all it likes as the Central Asian military leader, and no one is in a position to challenge it. Now, the ties with Pakistan fit into this, because Pakistan is the Taliban's sponsor and protector, and always has been. And that therefore, if you want to deal with the Taliban, you understand that you have to deal with Pakistan, because Pakistan has the power, as it has basically always had, to make sure that Afghanistan is not stable. Particularly because the Pakistani government is, one might almost say, hysterical about the subject of Indian involvement in Afghanistan. They see India as striking at its strategic hinterland, that's a Pakistani term, and by its involvement in Afghanistan. They see India behind all kinds of plots against it, and therefore the Taliban is its weapon against India and the Afghan government, which they regard as pro-Indian. So by connecting with Russia, Pakistan gains a partner against India, and the Russians gain a partner against India as well, because despite the bonhomie you saw with the visit to Modi, in fact, the Russians are very worried that India is gravitating towards the United States, that India will turn to the United States rather than Russia as a major military partner in terms of arms sales. Economically, Russia can't compete with what the US has to offer India, and even militarily, Russia can't compete in terms of actual capabilities that the US could deploy if a crisis broke out in South Asia. And when these crises break out, both sides expect the United States to intervene to calm things down. They don't expect or run to Moscow first. So Moscow is sending India a message: don't get too close to Washington. Otherwise we have options with Pakistan. And while they claim that their relationship with Pakistan is not anti-Indian, it's not seen that way in New Delhi. As I said, Moscow sees the Taliban as therefore being solely an Afghani phenomenon. It's not going to threaten Central Asia. That's probably part of the understandings they have with the Taliban, and therefore a reason for their support. And beyond that, as I said, there's a growing alliance. I think it even predates Ukraine, but certainly is accelerated after Ukraine, and a growing dependence on China. And the dependence can be seen all across the board. And it is very possible that the Chinese have talked to the Russians about improving ties with Pakistan, given that China is the, quote, all-weather friend, end of quote, of Pakistan, and would like to have its friends be friends with each other. And especially because China and India are rivals. And this is another way for China, indirectly, to limit India's capabilities in the subcontinent and keep it boxed in to where it is today. So Russia may well have been influenced by China in its larger thinking. At the same time, given the decline relative to China in Russian capabilities, and the fact that Russia is clearly soliciting China to invest in Russia, and even for an alliance, it has to prove to China, and this is also true in East Asia, that it is a major power worthy of China's interest and friendship. To use the German phrase, it has to prove that it's bundesfähig, that it's worthy of alliance. And allies constantly in relationships have to prove their bona fides to the other side, which is more powerful, if they want that other side to take their interests into account and to take this relationship of alliance or comprehensive strategic partnership seriously. So one way to do that is to show that we have a very good relationship with Pakistan, and that's growing, and that we are also, like you, anti-American and working to stop the Americans. Also, the Russians claim that they are afraid that NATO is going to be permanently involved in Afghanistan and that these bases are going to threaten Russia. I think that's ridiculous if you look at the size of the NATO capability, even though the bases are there. Furthermore, Afghanistan is now the last place NATO wants to be. But, anybody studying Russian security policy knows that from the beginning, Russia sees itself as facing strategic encirclement. As David knows, there used to be a phrase in the profession that Russia was the Soviet Union was the only country in the world threatened by socialist encirclement of hostile states. Russia still sees itself in this light, and therefore you want to get NATO out And you wanna play with Taliban as a way to do that. And therefore, finally, Moscow, by virtue of this policy, stakes its claim to being an influential external player in whatever happens in the future in Afghanistan. And despite 40 years of combat in Afghanistan, and however the war ultimately ends, it is by no means certain that Afghanistan will be spared the problem of the fact that its neighbors and even states beyond its neighbors all see themselves as having a legitimate external influence in Afghanistan and an Afghan card to play in Afghanistan's domestic politics. And for Russia, that's the Taliban. So, that's the what and the why, and now.
Okay, thank you. My colleague explained all the academic part. I have little to say. But what I'm going to touch it is just my own observation. It's not from the book, it's not from what I have heard it, but as a person who has been involved in this region for so many years, from the time that I was working with U.S. Embassy in Pakistan for 18 years, and we have seen the Russian invasions, the Taliban collapse, and up to now, which we see is, in that context I will say a few words. Actually, before touching to northern Afghanistan and Russia, I believe what is going on today is so much different from what was happening in the 80s and 70s when the Russian took place. At that time, it was clearly an invasion, and what the Afghans were fighting was that kind of freedom fight and also religiously a jihad. But now, it turned to be a clear and day by day increasing a proxy war. It's not even a civil war. It is increasing to the extent that just last Friday, when we were having our territorial meeting, one of my colleagues suggested that, hey, there is a new development going on in Balochistan. A big mullah announced that they have established 15 collection points to raise money for the Taliban in one province. Not one or two, 15. So, which is impossible to hide it from the eye of intelligence. I said, well, it could be part of that rumors that we are hearing in allegation and blame game. We cannot publish the story until we prove it. He said that, sir, the name of the mullah is mentioned in the leaflets, in this press release statement. So 2 hours later, he came with the full statement of that mullah, who was saying, the big Jamia mullah, who was saying that we are proudly establishing 15 points in the province of Balochistan to collect the ushur and zakat of during the holy month of Ramadan and give it to the Taliban. The mullah gave his name, his address, and everything. So we put the story in front of the interior minister of Balochistan. He said that, well, this is something new, I have to check about it. When the phone was turned off, when he himself told the reporter, you know who is calling the shot, why you are disturbing me. So the interior minister of a province cannot do anything about it, while the Pakistani establishment is pushing this merciless war. The country is burning, 34 provinces of Afghanistan are now in war. The fledgling Afghan army are launching up to 17 or 20 operations every day, while they have almost nothing in their hand. So they can, but on the other hand, they are confronting a nuclear power with a 1 million-man army with 75% budget of the whole country that they are consuming. So what happened is that the Pakistani push with full force destabilize more and more area of Afghanistan, drive the Afghan army out of the area, but the problem is they cannot control it. They are replacing a regular Afghan and NATO presence with a kind of indisciplined militia, Taliban, who do not know how to stabilize and control the situation, while they do not have the control over skies and things like this. And the Taliban themselves are confessing that they are taking the territory, but we cannot control it. Yet in just this last week, and three occasions, they said that they have not done it. Like yesterday there was a blast in the Herat mosque. Taliban said they haven't done it. There was attack on in Kabul city in suicide. They brought a tanker of oil tanker full of explosive and put it on the street and then exploded it with no target, visible target. Taliban said they are not involved. So, on one hand, Pakistan is conducting a naked interference, but on the other hand, their proxy cannot control the situation. This is leading to the foreign interference, to more foreign interference, and to more foreign militant presence, foreign involvement, to say, including Russia. This kind of situation, to destabilize an area and do not control it, brought Russia to Afghanistan, they brought IS to Afghanistan, they brought Iranian to Afghanistan, and they brought Chinese to Afghanistan, Turkeys, and many more. Otherwise, if there was a conventional war in two sides of the conflict, we would not have seen more and more power involved. The intensity of the war and in the interference in the destabilization of the country is now, unfortunately, destabilizing a relatively secure part of Afghanistan, which is northern Afghanistan. That does not only, northern Afghanistan these days are not only politically, militarily destabilizing, it is politically destabilizing as well, unfortunately. Because with the simultaneous interference on military side, there is an interference on political side as well. In the past 2 months, we have seen in the north that the two main power players of the north, the Commander Atta of Jamiat and Dostum, they are both in trouble. Dostum has left for Turkey as a part of reportedly a deal between the Afghan government and Turkey, and with his absence now provide good opportunity for the Taliban to increase their power. Because Dostum was at least a central point rallying this militia group around him, and Atta, if you probably heard, another strong man who was able to control northern Afghanistan is now involved in a kind of internal strife with the Jamiat party, its own party. The Jamiat party, which is kind of ruling party, second ruling party of Afghanistan, is divided into 3 parts. You have this Atta group, you have this Rabbani group, you have this the Abdullah, who is there. And on the other hand, the national unity government also provided, kind of an opportunity for the Taliban and the other factors to reign, and that has weakened the Afghan government as well. So you have a weak Afghan government, you have a destabilized situation, and you have more territory with no one control. So of course, the Russians are concerned. So more and more area in northern Afghanistan and the border with the Central Asian states are turning to no man's land. And ICE jumped into the situation in 2015, and when they first appeared in Nangarhar, and then they started from Orozgan. Let me tell you about how IS came to Afghanistan. When the Taliban were in power, so many of the Central Asians, these jihadis or dissidents, mainly from IUD, came to Afghanistan. They resided with the Taliban. In that context, Russia is wrong that they believe that the Talibans are not dangerous. They are good. They came to Afghanistan, they established their bases, and then when the Taliban collapsed, they went to this Fatah, the area which we broadcast to. But after a few years, they developed differences with the people of local people because they had cultural differences. So the people of the area has risen against them, and they were driven out of the area. They came and established their presence in Uruzgan in southern Afghanistan. In southern Afghanistan, and then they also had some problem with the local Taliban. And then they thought that their presence here in southern Afghanistan, far away from the Central Asian state or former Soviet Union border, is meaningless. So they have started moving in two directions toward the Central Asian, toward the Afghanistan border with Central Asian states. One group, which were mainly the jihadis, the former jihadis and the affiliates of Al-Qaeda, they moved toward northeastern Afghanistan, which starts from Badakhshan and goes up to the Mazar-e Sharif in Samangan, in Kunduz. The other group, which is mainly IMU, in that time they were called themselves Jundullah, they went to northwestern Afghanistan. They started, we start from Jawzjan, Faryab, in Saripur. And they were stationed there. They were there and they were doing their recruitment, they were doing preparing their jihadi preparation. And while the other parts, the third part of Daesh, which was established themselves in Nangarhar, they were the former Taliban, Pakistani Taliban, which were defeated and then were regrouped, by mysterious forces, which is believed to be again Pakistanis, who want them to serve as a plan B for the Taliban. So you have three kinds of Daesh in Afghanistan. The Pakistani Taliban, former Pakistani Taliban defeated, and they are in Nangarhar, in eastern Afghanistan. You have the former jihadis, Central Asian jihadis, and they are in northeastern Afghanistan. You have the purely IMU, who are now stationed in northwestern Afghanistan. So these three groups with three different agendas. So came to Afghanistan, and two of them in northern Afghanistan. And of course, Russia has to be concerned. In that case, I believe the Russian concern is very much legitimate, because the blame does not go to neither the NATO or not the Afghan government or not the international community. It's all about Pakistan. Because when Pakistan destabilizes the situation, the Afghan government cannot do anything, the international community cannot do anything, and the Russian cannot do anything. So the result is the growing militant presence in Afghanistan. When the vacuum is created, everybody is jumping. So that's why I think in 2015, the first Russian interference was seen when they established a big center in Zahedan, city of Iran. That center is called Al-Ansar, in which Iranian and Russians and the Taliban are coordinating their meetings. The former Taliban chief, Mullah Mansour, was there to inaugurate the center. When he was coming back, he was hit by the drone missile. How do we know this? The Taliban splinter group, who was break away from the Taliban, they discovered this through their own friends, and they said that the Russians and Iranians and the Taliban regularly meet in the Zahedan center, which is called Al-Ansar. The Russians' light weapons are brought there to stop Daesh in that part of the country, and then the Taliban representative pick the arms from that area and bring it to Western Afghanistan. So in that case, Russia and Iran are protecting their own interests for that region. Now, in northwestern Afghanistan, the Russians are dealing with the Taliban to stop Daesh or IS presence in these provinces, which mainly border with Tajikistan. Badakhshan, Takhar, Kunduz have border with Tajikistan. In that part, there are former jihadis who have separate camps, but they are under the control of Taliban. in ISIS in Taliban have kind of different kind of relation to them. In northeast, in eastern Afghanistan, which is Nangarhar, Daesh or IS and Taliban are fighting each other. They are enemy because they know that they are plan A and plan B. They are fighting for the territory, and they know that if one is defeated, the other will catch the eye of the master. In northeastern Afghanistan, in Badakhshan, Takhar sector, the ISIS, or Daesh is pronounced, is working under the Taliban. Mainly because, on one hand, the Taliban are enjoying full support of the Russians. The second reason is that the Taliban command in northeastern Afghanistan is under Pashtuns, mainly. Mainly Pashtuns are calling the shots in northeastern Afghanistan, in the Taliban ranks. The center is Kunduz, Baghlan, so top Taliban commanders are Pashtun. So Pashtuns does not allow them to take more role or to take more control of the situation. On the other hand, it has a border with Russia. It's much easy for the Russians to cross the Amu River and give them the support. So in that part, the Russians are pretty much safe because they have contact with the Taliban. Taliban upper hand. But what the Russians worried about is northwestern Afghanistan. Because in northwestern Afghanistan, on one hand, you have a more centralized Daesh, which is IMU. The son of Tahir Yildash, Malik Yildash, is stationed in Saripul province, Sayab district, there. So one of the commander who met him told my friend that he was, Malik has a kind of 400, 500 people, and he was logistically in a very good position. The shoes, the clothes, and the weapons. And he said that Malik told him that he's not going to start until he is fully prepared. So the Russians are worried about them because they are far away from the Central Asia borders. It is a kind of mountainous area located in the center of the north. The Russians cannot reach them from the border of the Afghan-Tajik border, not from Afghan-Uzbek border. And so, the second reason that they are concerned is that in that part, the Taliban and Daesh has kind of equal status. The reason is because the Taliban in leadership, in the Daesh leadership, both are Uzbek. So Uzbek, because of the ethnic structures, cannot force his fellow Uzbek to suppress Daesh. In one village, you see half of the villages with Daesh and half of the villages with the Taliban. And both are same tribe. This is not a situation in eastern Afghanistan, and also this is not a situation in northeastern Afghanistan. Because in northeast, they are culturally different, they are ethnically different, so they cannot have much. And also, as I said, the Russians are giving them supplies through the Afghan-Tajik border very easily. So this is and to add to that is that the destabilization of the Afghan forces, Afghan strongmen or strong parties in northern Afghanistan. So this two scenario is giving a lot of concern to the Russians, because on one hand you see the Afghans government structure is falling apart. The main parties are in trouble, like Jamiat in Jumbish of Dostum. One strongman left the country, another strongman is involved in internal strife. And on the other hand, the Aish has almost upper hand over the Taliban. In the past 2 months, there were continuous fighting between Daesh and Taliban in this northwestern Afghanistan, of Saripol and Faryab in Pakistan. And on many occasions, the Taliban were badly defeated. That's why in this question of and 2 helicopters, the helicopters landing in the north came in. just before coming to US, I fully investigated this, to know, at least to estimately know that, to guess who these two helicopters belong to. There were two theories. One was that these are American helicopters. They are supplying Daesh to strengthening them against the Taliban. The other theory was no, these are Russian helicopters who came here to support the Taliban because the Taliban were being defeated, constantly by the Daesh. And but when I talked to, my conclusion was, after talking to too many people of the area, say that the area where the helicopter landing are not controlled by the Daesh. They are purely controlled by the Taliban. So Daesh is much away from the area of this Sayad, where the helicopter landed. And the landing is proven. The Afghan government, Deputy Chief of Army Staff went and visited the area. He confirmed it. The Governor of Saripur confirmed that yes, and also the Governor Atta, they all confirmed that the helicopter landed. But everybody is tight-lipped. Nobody said who this helicopter belonged to. But the evidence shows that it is, of course, Russians, because in that area is very flat area, and the helicopters can fly in 2,000 feet altitude to reach that area. So it's very much possible that it is Russian helicopter, mainly because they are worried that if Taliban are defeated, like as in the past 2 months I said, frequently the Taliban are losing ground to Daesh. It's even to the extent that 2 weeks ago we had a report from Faryab that a dozen of Taliban, of Daesh family came to an area and started building houses, while the area is under the control of Taliban, but the Taliban could not tell them anything. It's because of the ethnic structure. So they are just, in some area, they are just turning blind eye, but in some area in northwestern Afghanistan, IS is gaining ground. So what they are concerned about is that if they overrun this northwestern Afghanistan, so they could easily reach the Afghan-Uzbek border. The Afghan-Tajik border is far away. In Afghan-Turkmen border is a bit calm. Mainly probably because the Turkmens have less militant in Daesh or in Taliban. And also they enjoy a good relation with the Taliban, and they take their injured people. So, but the real worry and the real problem is here. And to sum up is that the Russian had deal with Iranians, to stop IS in southern Afghanistan. The Russian had deal with the Taliban to stop the Taliban from doing influence in Tajikistan, in northeastern Afghanistan. And the Russians are now, dropping arms from helicopter to the area of Saripur and of northwestern Afghanistan in order to stop the Taliban defeat, or to stop the IS to take over the area. So my conclusion is that the bottom line is, the root of the problem is that if the Pakistani interference does not stop, neither Russian can win this war, nor NATO can win this war, nor the Afghan government. Because they keep, sending arms, ammunition, and money in a way that it's like an open war. So as long as they are destabilizing the situation, the Afghan government will be in a constant fighting. NATO will be in constant fighting. In many foreign, foreign fighters and foreign elements may jump in and get involved, because it's a no man's land. It is like a completely chaotic situation, and for foreign fighters, for foreign militants, for bad guys, this is an ideal situation.
Well, thank you both. I propose now to open the floor for questions and comments. So please introduce yourself.